Hello and welcome to the La Jolla Presbyterian Church Women's Ministry Bible Study Podcast. This podcast was originally recorded on Wednesday, November 29th, 2017, and the teaching is led by Cynthia Blaze, our Director of Women's Ministries. Cynthia is looking at the story, chapter 11. That's the story of young King David. If you have other questions or would like to get connected with the church, you can visit our website at ljpress.org, that's ljpres.org, or you can call the church office, 858-454-0713. Enjoy the Bible study, and God bless you.
Well, good morning, ladies. I'm so glad to be with you again. It's been a couple weeks now because we were gone on our annual little Mexico trip, which was fun. We had a really good time. And I know that Alex led the study while I was gone, and it sounds like it was great. So I hope for those of you who are here liked it. And then last week we podcasted it because it was the week before, or the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And so if all of you followed along, you also heard about my full-on war with my daughter, which is still in process. But no, we're sleeping great, but she doesn't have any toys yet. She's only gained one back. So she is a strong-willed little daughter. I felt like I should share that story because I'm not a perfect person, and I don't know if I did it right or I don't know if I did it wrong, but I'm just trying to find my way as a mom too and do my best. But so we're still at war, my daughter and I. But at this point, I was telling this table over here that at this point, I think she's almost just forgone everything she's lost. She told me, she goes, "Mom, I really like my room. It's really clean now," which is very true because there's nothing in it. And I think she's just looking forward to Christmas. She's pretty much like, well, that stuff is all gone. I'm never earning it back. I'm just going to look forward to whatever comes next. So, my daughter. She's a strong-willed little amazing little gift that the Lord gave me. All right, so I think you ladies all know each other by now at your tables. Let me open in prayer, and then we'll get ourselves started. Father, thank you for this time that we have together. Thank you for these amazing women who show up to study your word. I pray that you will speak through me through this time together. I pray that we will all learn about you and grow closer to you through this time. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, so like we do every time, I'm going to start with a little bit of review. If you'll notice, we also added poster number 3 behind me, which I'm really excited about. So we have actually moved on in our time period, which is great. I'm also really excited because I think some of you know that I have been working with a graphic designer to create actually a fold-out that you can stick in your Bible of this full timeline, all 5 posters I made. And it's actually supposedly arriving today at my house, so I'm very excited. So I will have those next week. I will be selling them for a small fee just based on my cost of putting them out, but they're only going to be $5 each. So I'm really excited about those. I'll have them if you want to bring your $5 next time. You can be my first purchasers. So it'll be great. So just to review again. So as we're still in the Old Testament, we are looking at the continuous story of Scripture. And while we are in the Old Testament, we are looking at the expectation for Christ in the Old Testament. So we learned from the beginning that there was a sense of us in creation, that a triune God was present in creation, Father, Son, and Spirit. We learned that after the fall, there was that prophecy that was given over the serpent. The enmity will follow between the offspring of Eve and the offspring and the serpent. The serpent will strike his heel, but ultimately the offspring will crush the head of the serpent. And we gain through that the sense that there is a plan that somehow an offspring of Eve will bring about the end of Satan. And that right now we live in what I'm calling the time of the partial crushing, right? Where we still have the very presence of sin in our world, and we look forward to a time when Satan is fully crushed, when Jesus returns. We've talked about how God reached out and established a covenant with Abraham. There are 3 parts to this covenant. We've gone over this so many times. What were the 3 parts? What were the 3 Ps? Anyone? Progeny, exactly. So his offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. What was another P? Place. I heard that the actual place of Canaan would be an everlasting inheritance, and then that promise that somehow all the nations of the world would be blessed through an offspring of Abraham, which we only see as being fulfilled in Jesus. And then we talked about how this covenant was reestablished with Isaac and Jacob. It's then passed on to Jacob's fourth son, Judah. And remember, when Jacob dies, there's another prophecy given over Judah. And that prophecy is the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations will be his. So that's where we begin to get the sense that a great king will come from the line of Judah. And it's going to be fun because today we're going to get to that first great king that does come from the line of Judah, which is going to be David. So that's exciting. So we also see in that why it's so important that the New Testament writers trace the lineage of Jesus to Judah, right? Because they are all wanting to say, this is that long expected king. This is the one that was supposed to come. And we saw how through the story of Joseph that the Israelites were moved to Egypt to weather the famine, and how they became so numerous that they were enslaved. And then we got Moses. And as a little side, over the break, the kids and I actually watched Prince of Egypt, which I hadn't ever watched with them. And I would say it was a little bit, maybe over the head of my 5-year-old, some parts of it. But my 7.5, almost 8-year-old, loved it. And it was an awesome movie. I hadn't watched it in probably 10 years. And they really get at some of just the real core point of the story, which is great. I also thought it was very interesting that they really portray the Pharaoh that Moses goes back to confront as most likely would have been like a brother figure that he was raised in, and how they would have had a previous relationship. And I thought that was just a really cool way to portray the story, and is probably most likely accurate. So just a little aside, that was fun. And we talked about how that last plague, when all the Israelites are about to depart Egypt, is that plague of the firstborn, and how they are all told that they're supposed to put the blood of the lamb on their doorposts. And if so, then the angel of death will pass over all of their houses, right? So then they leave. So we get this point where the Israelites are exiting Egypt, and they're led by cloud and by fire by God. They are led to the Red Sea purposely so that we will see the power of God. How Pharaoh's army pursues them, and then we see this amazing moment of this whole Red Sea parted and all the Israelites walking through. And then we have this period of the desert journey where God acts in a way to create relationship with his people, how he has manna and quail and sustains them every single day, where God gives them the 10 Commandments in the desert, and they establish that tabernacle where God dwells in the midst of his people. But remember that there is the holy place, and that there is a holy of holies inside that tabernacle, and that only the high priest can go inside that holy of holies once a year, right? And so we still get the sense that God is so holy that we humans cannot be around him. And that's what we see in that Old Testament. And that's what's going to be changed. Remember, I talked about how when Christ is crucified and the curtain is torn in two in the temple, it's that curtain between the holy, most holy place and the holy of holies, showing that now we have access to God. So when we look at things like the tabernacle, it gives us that bigger picture of Christ, because we begin to understand the history behind why things were so significant. So we saw that they spend 2 years first in the desert. They get the law at Mount Sinai, and then they send the spies out to explore the land. That's their first attempt at Canaan. We get the majority and the minority reports, how Josh and Caleb say, let's go. And everyone says, no, but there's giants in the land and fortified cities, and it's too much for us. And that bad report is spread. And what do they want to do? Do you remember? What did all the Israelites say we're going to do? We're going to go back to Egypt. We're going to elect a new leader. We're done with you, Moses. We're out of here. We're going back to Egypt. We're going back to slavery. And so because of that, it's decreed 38 more years in the desert until everyone 20 and over has died. So that's where we get that 40-year wandering, right? It's the first 2 years after 2 years, they have their first attempt at Canaan. And then it's 38 years later, they actually have their second attempt, which actually works. They return to the border of Canaan. They're finally allowed to enter it. Moses dies. Joshua is elected as their new leader. We saw how the Jordan River was parted at flood stage, and all the Israelites crossed through it. We saw the story of Rahab, the prostitute, how she hides 2 Israelite spies, and she asks them to remember her family when they take the land. And we saw that story of the Israelites marching around Jericho and the walls falling down. And I played you all that VeggieTales song. Just one of my favorites. We're going to knock your walls down, which is great. And then we saw how Rahab is rescued and how she later becomes the great-great-grandmother of David, which is just, to me, an amazing story. How Joshua becomes old, he eventually dies, and Canaan is mostly conquered at his death, but not entirely conquered. And at his death, Joshua reminds everyone that this promise of them being in the land is contingent on them being faithful to God. That this land is an everlasting inheritance given to them, but they have to be faithful to be able to actually dwell in it, to live in it. And so he reminds them, do not worship the gods and idols of the people around you. And all the Israelites at Shechem, they say, we will be faithful. And we know that this is very short-lived, that after Joshua and all the elders of his generation die, that there's assimilation, there's idol worship. This is what we call the time period of the judges, where there's no single leader. It's a loose confederacy of these 12 states. God raises up different judges to lead the people. These judges were twofold, military leader and someone who sort of arbitrated arguments. And we saw, except in the story of Deborah and Barak, where Deborah was the arbitrator, Barak was the military leader. But otherwise, they generally were supposed to have the role of both of those two. And we read the story of Samuel, how he was a prophet dedicated in the womb by his mom, actually dedicated before conception by his mother to be 100% given to the Lord. And disorder and unity are just rampant during this time period of the judges. It talks about how the highways were unsafe. And so we get this period, this kind of seems very chaotic. And because of that, what do the people want? Do you remember? They want order, and they ask for a king. Because it's so chaotic at this point. They see these big, strong nations around them. They say, we want to be like the nations around us. They want that sense of strength and unity and a single leader who's going to defend them. So God allows this request, and how Samuel goes and anoints the first king of Israel. What was his name? Saul, first king of Israel. And do you remember how he is described? Does anybody remember? This was from our podcast. Tall and handsome. Obviously the perfect leader because he was tall and handsome. And I was thinking as I was reading that, isn't that sometimes how we elect our leaders now, right? Tall and handsome. Nothing much except I heard some rumblings about our current leader, which we just won't say anything about. But anyway, in general, the people that we sort of put forward as our idols, all of our celebrities, we love good looks still. But I remember, it's just funny because Saul appears very reluctant. I don't know if you remember, but where is he when this whole selection process for the first king goes on? Do you remember where he is? He's hiding in the luggage, it says, like a storeroom. Saul is hiding. He doesn't we get the sense he's sort of a reluctant first king, but he really tries to get it right. Saul really tries to obey Samuel. He really tries to be this spiritual, godly king. But he fails. He fails to listen to God. He fails to trust God at times. And Samuel tells Saul that this throne is going to be taken from you. And that's where we actually arrive this week. So that's our review. I feel like our review is just going to get longer and longer and longer every single time, right? I'll be reviewing the whole Bible, and then we'll be 1 minute for scripture. Okay, this week we're going to look at the second half of 1 Samuel. We are going to follow David's journey from being a shepherd to being a king. And we're going to answer the question, how did David become king if Saul was still in charge? How did that actually happen? And why did God choose David? What was it about David that God chose him? So we're going to start with context. As I say all the time, one of my professors in seminary used to always say, context is king. So we're talking about context. So author, we're lumping the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel together. Okay, so 1st and 2nd Samuel. Does anybody guess on who they think the author was? Louder, I didn't quite hear it. Samuel, we're going to say, yes. Okay, so 1st and 2nd Samuel were considered one book in Hebrew tradition. Okay, no author is given specifically at the beginning. Many books will start and say and sort of declare who the authorship is. So no author is actually given. We know that the prophet Samuel did make some records. We know that from 1 Samuel 10:25. We also know from Chronicles 29:29 that the prophet Samuel, Nathan, and Gad recorded many of the acts of David. So it's written down that those prophets recorded. So what we kind of assume is most likely an ancient historian probably compiled a number of books of Samuel, Nathan, and Gad, sort of the three main prophets at that time, and probably put them together in these two books, which originally the Hebrew scriptures consider 1st and 2nd Samuel one book. It's in our Christian tradition that we have separated them into two books. Audience, who do you guess that the book was written for? Israelites. Good job. Yes. Ding, ding, ding. Good job. Okay. Original intent. Why do you think that the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel were written? Any guesses? What was that? You can say it louder. Show God's work. Absolutely. History. Yep, exactly. So historical narrative with a theological message. Exactly. So the leadership of, and I think one of the main points they're trying to show is that the leadership of Israel needs to revere God. That what if the leadership of Israel is not following God, what's going to happen? And so really showing what a faithful king or a faithful leader looks like. When do the events in this occur? Any guesses? I'll back up from last time. So it's essentially, they're going to cover about 110 years of history, 1st and 2nd Samuel. They start at about 1120 BC when Samuel is born. And 1st Samuel goes through Saul's death in about 1010 BC. 2nd Samuel then follows the 40 years of David's reign from 1010 BC to 970 BC. So David will reign for 40 years, which mostly we're going to focus on David's reign next week, actually. When was it compiled? Most likely probably compiled towards the end of David's reign. So most likely all of these narratives were put together towards the end of his reign, about 970 BC. And would have been, scholars will say it must have been compiled no later than 722 BC, because that is when the Assyrians take northern Israel captive. And such an event would have been so significant that it would have been mentioned, even in things like as in occurring before the exile or things like that. So because that's not mentioned, we're going to assume that these books were all compiled before the exile actually occurs. Historical context, what's going on in the ancient Near East? Because it's really interesting that both Saul and David are going to be able to create this very unified and very strong military country of Israel during this time period. So it is going to become the dominant nation along sort of the eastern seaports of the Mediterranean. Like if you guys can kind of imagine a map right now where Israel is along that Mediterranean coast, they actually become the dominant sort of mini superpower of that area. So how are they able to do that? And what we see historically is that the other main three sort of superpowers at that time, which would have been Egypt, the Assyrians, and the Hittites, are all kind of in points of sort of internal decline in their own. All of them kind of go through waves of sort of like power and less power. And what's interesting is those sort of 70 years of Saul and David, all three of those nations are really not sending out people to try and conquer around them. They're very much focused on sort of internal conflicts going on inside their own nations, which are our own empires, which is interesting because that sort of allows Israel to have this period of very strong military success. The most troubling neighbor of the Israelites who are going to be our biggest problem. Do you remember, ladies, who's our Philistines? So the Philistines, one of the Canaanite people groups that are never entirely destroyed when they take over Canaan, even though they're supposed to. That was the whole idea of, even though it's not fun to talk about, the whole idea of wiping out all of the people groups in Canaan was the idea of creating a nation that was not going to be lured away by the gods and the practices of the nations around them. So it's not fun to hear about wiping out all the people in Canaan, but the idea was to create sort of this separated people group, this kingdom of priests, this holy nation. So the Philistines are one of those Canaanite people groups that are never entirely wiped out. And they're always going to sort of be a thorn in the flesh of the Israelites. So biblical context, where do 1st and 2nd Samuel fall in the whole context of the Bible? After Ruth, so we could go, let's see, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel. Okay, so we're books 9 and 10 of the Bible. That's our biblical context. And then last one, genre. What kind of writing would you guess that 1st and 2nd Samuel are? Historical, exactly. So primarily historical writing, which is meant to be understood historically and literally, with the exception of a few bits of poetry. Hannah's prayer, that's poetry. There's some hymns and proverbs thrown in at times. But it generally, it's supposed to be considered historical. All right, so let's get to our study today. Let's read about the story of David. It should be a good week. It's really fun to read about someone who generally gets it right. I feel like we've read about a lot of people who kind of get it wrong. And so this should be hopefully a nice week to read about someone that is enjoyable to read about. Okay, I'm going to start in 1 Samuel 16, and I'm just going to start with 1 through 5. So at this point, contextually, Saul is still our king, but Samuel has come to Saul and told him, your mantle of leadership is being taken from you. The kingdom is going to be taken from you, Saul, because you have disobeyed God enough times. All right. So the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. But Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. The Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, do you come in peace? Samuel replied, yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. All right, little break. So God tells Samuel, stop mourning for Saul, showing that Samuel was sad about Saul's having the kingship taken from him. So Samuel did like him. God tells Samuel to take his horn and fill it with what? Oil, exactly. So this would have been most likely a ram's horn and would be a sense of you are taking this to anoint the next king. Why is Samuel afraid? He's a little bit worried. He thinks, if I go and anoint a new king and this, current King Saul hears about it, then it might be the end for him. So he's worried about it. What town do they go to? Bethlehem, exactly. So let's fast forward to Jesus' birth. Remember, what town does Joseph go to? Because he has to register. Bethlehem, exactly. So David lives in Bethlehem because he is from the tribe of Judah. We know that Joseph was from the tribe of Judah. That's why he had to return to Bethlehem. Also remember, he is also the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz, who lived in Bethlehem. So we can see that his family just hasn't moved. I mean, Ruth and Boaz lived in Bethlehem. He's the great-grandson of them. So the family is still there. So that's where David's family lives. And at this point, people really did live in their tribes. So he was living in the tribe of Judah. Also remember, according to the prophecy at Jacob's deathbed, what line is the future king supposed to come from? Judah, yep, from family of David, line of Judah. Good job. Okay, so God sends Samuel to Bethlehem with this excuse that he is going to make a sacrifice. And so it's a sacrificial feast. He tells everyone you have to change your clothes. He brings a bull. I just kind of Googled why a bull. And so I kind of found out through reading a couple different websites is just that no one's exactly specifically sure. Paul talked about how it may have been that to atone for a murder, that's why he had brought a bull. Bulls were used. But really what it says is that if an animal was sacrificed to atone for sin, it wasn't eaten. It was all burned before the Lord. But when an animal is sacrificed as a peace offering, a fellowship offering, or a consecration offering, then part of it is burnt and part of it is eaten in sort of a special ceremony. So they're all going to sit down to this feast together because this is either peace offering, fellowship offering, or some kind of consecration offering. Okay, so let's keep reading. So I'm picking up in verse 6. So when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, and this is one of my favorite lines from today, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He's tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrived." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Okay, so the sons are sent sort of in this parade in front of Samuel, right? And Samuel at first thinks, it must be Eliab. Now, later on in 17:13, it talks about the order of birth. And so what we understand from that, just a chapter later, is that Eliab was the oldest. So they're kind of passing by him from oldest to youngest. So it would seem like the oldest might be, the one we would kind of assume would be king. So he's not. And also, why does Samuel think that Eliab is the natural choice? What does it say about him? He's tall and good looking, just like Saul, right? So you've got another tall, good looking guy. Okay, so do you remember how Saul described, Saul was described that same way when he was chosen, very tall, very good looking. Okay, but Eliab reminds Eliab reminds Samuel of Saul because of his appearance. But what does God say to Samuel and how he evaluates people? He looks at the heart. Exactly. I love that. So all 7 are passed by. None of them are chosen. And then he says, "Isn't there one more?" And what does he say? The youngest with the sheep. And I think it's interesting that David isn't even invited, wasn't there someone else? Yeah, so totally Cinderella, not invited to the ball. Wasn't there someone else who could have kept the sheep? I mean, it says later chapters that, when he goes off to fight Goliath, that he leaves the sheep with hired people. So it seems like there were hired people who could have watched the sheep. But for some reason, his age or who he was, that his family doesn't think he's significant enough to show up. We don't. The word that's used for him is like a young man. And so that can really encompass anyone pretty much under 25 or 30. So when he goes off to fight Goliath, we like to think of maybe the 7 or 8 year old, but he well could have been 19, 20 at this point. He's still considered young, but he probably was not like a child. But I don't know. So we don't get an exact age for him at this point. I love that too. The point was just made that when we think of Jesus as the good shepherd, we already see that. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so for whatever reason, he's not invited, but when God saw his heart, God knew that he was the right man, that there was something about his heart, who he was. And this is not anything scriptural, but I almost wonder if Saul was chosen first, almost to create that contrast. This is just a Cynthia thought, nothing that I've researched, but to see this guy, he was first tall, good looking, sort of like the natural choice, do a good job, but not a great job. And then we see, well, that's not really what God looks for, right? God looks for someone who has the kind of heart that follows him. And so we almost get this contrast created by these two men. Okay, so David is anointed. Saul doesn't know that he's anointed, and actually Saul's going to rule for 30 more years at this point. It's interesting that the Bible says an evil spirit from the Lord begins to torment Saul. But it's interesting, it says from the Lord, which I always think is very interesting. His attendants Saul's attendants asked if someone could come and play the lyre, which is an instrument for Saul, because somehow it sort of helps soothe him. And I guess David has a reputation of being someone who plays the lyre very well. And so somehow that gets out, and David is called, is sought for. And now remember, Saul doesn't know that he's been anointed as king. And so it's kind of an interesting situation to imagine. David isn't telling anyone, hey, I was anointed as king. But he goes, and the text says that Saul likes him very much. And for this season, actually it says that David goes back and forth between Saul's palace and his father's household. So he kind of goes back and forth, tending sheep, playing the lyre for Saul. And then this is the context that sets up the great story of David and Goliath, which, of course, we can't study David without studying David and Goliath because it's a great story. So remember, Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon are historically in kind of this sort of decline period at this point. And the major people that are sort of like the problem people at this point are the Philistines. And the Philistines kind of continually attack Israel. It's sort of like these little battles going on back and forth all the time. So I'm going to pick up our story in 1 Samuel 17, verse 2, and carry on from there. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels on his legs. He wore bronze greaves. Greaves were kind of like on your shins. So like something like, if you can imagine, like an armor on your shin that didn't cover the knee because they still had to be able to walk. So it's like a shocker shin guard. It was like a bronze shin guard. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, bronze greaves and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was a weaver's rod, and his iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted at the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Okay, little breather. So we get Goliath. Isn't that like, for us, a synonym with like huge, insurmountable? Like that word has become part of like our English lore, our English language. Like if something is Goliath, it's just like too big to encounter. And so how tall, I looked at how tall was this guy, okay? Because it gives sort of like old measurements. So if we take it exactly as it's written, he would have been 9 foot, 9 inches. But the Septuagint says 6'9". So do you remember how I told you, ladies, that our whole text, the entire Old Testament scriptures, are translated from one single compilation called the Masoretic text, which was compiled in about 1000 AD. So the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, was compiled centuries earlier. So what modern scholars will do is they'll compare like the different translations, sometimes to see could a word have been slightly changed. And again, as I told you ladies before, there was never a time where it says like Jesus was just a great prophet, or instead of like Jesus was the Son of God. There's nothing theological that changes at all as we compare the differences, but there could be little tiny words that could have been changed. And so 6'9" I think seems a lot easier to sort of believe. I know a guy named who's 6'8". In our family, we call him the gentle giant because he's very tall. But you can kind of imagine a man being 6'9". We know of men currently who are 6'9", and that's still very tall. 9'9" seems a little bit hard to imagine.
It would be impossible for one normal.
Yes.
Where 6'9" wouldn't be possible.
Well, still would be, I think 6'9", though, would still be very scary. And also, I think at this point, people were shorter in general. So, like, a tall man might have been 5 foot, and so still getting someone 6'9", and we don't exactly know. But I just wanted to make that note that the Septuagint, which is translated from earlier texts, puts him at 6'9". So whichever he is, 6'9" or 9'9", he was stinking tall. He should have played basketball. I love that. Okay, so Goliath challenges one person to a duel, and this is actually a common form of warfare that did happen back then, though typically it was the two kings of nations that would have fought each other. And so it's very telling that Saul kind of like cowers and does not go out to meet Goliath. Saul should have been the one to go out and fight Goliath at this point. And so we see that Saul looks at Goliath really through like human eyes, right? He sees this big dude in a lot of armor and is like, heck no way. I'm not fighting this guy. And they're all scared. And this is where we get David. Enter David into the picture. Okay, so I'm going to pick our story in 17:17. Now Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. So it's actually David's oldest 3 brothers are all with Saul's army right now. There was Saul and the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd. See, he can leave him in the care of a shepherd. Loaded up and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. So here are like the incentives. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? I love that he should defy the armies of the living God. Okay, I'm just going to skip a little bit and go over to verse 11. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul replied, you are not able to go against the Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistines. All right, brief pause. Okay, so David's 3 oldest brothers, they're part of Saul's army. Father Jesse's worried about them, sends David to check on them. So while there, David hears Goliath taunt the Israelites. And it says actually that in a part we skipped over, that he'd been doing it for 40 days. So for 40 days, Goliath has been coming out, taunting the Israelite army. So I love David's response. I just think it's great. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? I just love that. And so when you, even just hearing the word living, how do you think David sort of thought of God in his life? This is the living God. Any thoughts? Very present. Yeah. Super present, protective, active. Exactly. Those are the exact words I thought of. So David's comments are reported to Saul, and Saul summons David. But Saul kind of opposes them fighting. And why? What does Saul say about David? You're too young. You haven't practiced. You don't know how to be a warrior. And what reason does David give that he can defeat Goliath? The Lord rescues him. And he says very specifically, I have beat the lion. I have beat the bear. And I think why, and who does he say will actually rescue him? The Lord. And so it's not that he's saying that by his might, he's beat the lion and the bear in the past. He's saying it's by the power of God. And so if the power of God has been with him in the past, he can trust that the power of God is going to be with him now. And I think this is a cool, important point to just focus on for a sec, because it's not like David has never had any experience of trusting God. He has had a lot of experience already of trusting God. And I think that that's where, for us, faith comes from. It's not that suddenly we have this huge thing we have to handle and go, I don't know what to do. It's God sort of leads us in these paths where we have experience of trusting him. And I think that's what allows us to trust him more and more. So when we look back and when we're sort of encounter the giants in our life, I think we have to look back and look, how has God already protected me? How has God already fought for me in my past? And that allows us to have that faith to step forward into whatever the new thing is that he's calling us to. So David says he is not relying on his strength, but on God's. All right, so let's see how this story goes down. I'm going to pick it up again back in 17b. Okay, Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put on a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around. But he was not used to them. I know. Can you just picture this guy like trying to walk around? "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" I just love that. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, and this is a great line, "You come at me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and the gates of Rekron. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a sec. Okay, so David initially puts on Saul's armor, but he's not used to it. People who actually talk about, or scholars who look at how old he was, actually point and say it wasn't necessarily that he was too small for it. It's just that he wasn't used to it. He had not been someone, who wore this kind of armor before. So that's why we think that he was probably grown, though still young. He takes 5 smooth stones in his sling, and I like what Goliath says, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" I just love that. And what is David's response? What does he say? He says, "You come at me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel." So which is stronger, sword and spear and javelin or living God? It's just kind of awesome to see that contrast. So David takes a stone, hurls it at Goliath, and strikes him and knocks him to the ground. He then runs up and cuts off his head. Or kills him and cuts off his head. So in our little stories of David and Goliath, we sort of think the stone is what killed him. The stone is not what killed him. The stone knocks him over. And then David runs up and actually kills him at that point. The Philistines freak out. Their hero is dead, and they all run. So the Israelites pursue them, kill a ton of them that day. And it later actually says, and a part I didn't read, is that David takes the weapons of Goliath and puts them in his own tent. So it's kind of like his, little plunder he gets out of it. Obviously, it's a great story. But I want to, just as a little side note that I think is fun, just sort of looking at text. Have you ladies ever wondered why, if Goliath is hit in the forehead, he falls forward? Has that ever been something that has crossed your minds? So there have been a lot of scholars that have kind of looked at this story lately. And in Hebrew, the word for forehead has the exact same consonants as the word for greave. So remember what the greave was? It was what covered your shin. So I actually put some little pieces of paper on your desks or your tables just for fun. And this is really nothing important, but just because I'm a nerd, I think it's fun. Because I'm a total nerd. So if you can look, do you see? So Hebrew is read from right to left. And can you see how those two words actually look the same? So it's comparing forehead and greave. One of them is plural, and that's why it has that extra letter added on the left side. I don't know if you can see that. But do you see what's below them? Do you see how there's little dots? So this is just a little history lesson. So originally, the Hebrew language only consisted of consonants. It did not actually consist of any vowels. No vowels are in the Hebrew language, only consonants. So oral tradition was so strong in the early years of the Hebrew language that they didn't actually need vowels because, and I think if you actually read, I actually was doing research on this online, and if you read a short sentence without vowels, you would probably understand it because it would still sort of make sense, like God is GD instead of GOD. But that's because we're very fluent in English and we can sort of like read through things and get it. And so what started to happen is that as post sort of the time of Jesus, a lot of the Jewish people began to spread out throughout the world. And at this point, some of them were no longer native Hebrew speakers. And so a bunch of scribes then began to add vowel points. So about 600 AD, a group called the Masoretes, a group of scribes, began to add vowel points to all of the Hebrew, so that if you were not a native Hebrew speaker, you could actually then begin to read it. And they are the ones who then compiled what we call our Masoretic text, which is the earliest continuous Hebrew we have of the Old Testament.
Dot and tittle? What is that?
The dots and tittles, yeah. And so when Jesus, yes, well, dots and tittles. So those are also, were extra points also added in. Yeah, exactly. So those little points. So all those little points below were not original to the original Hebrew. Does that make sense? It was only those consonants. So it would be easy then for a word. So words were sort of understood by context and by tradition. And so it kind of came down in, it could have easily come down in tradition, the sense that the stone hit him in the forehead. But you can see how the words are actually the same words without any of the dots and tittles added in, without any of the vowel points. So what some scholars have been saying is that there's a good chance it actually did not hit him in the forehead, because if a stone going 60 miles an hour hit you in the forehead, you would fall backwards, right? But if it hit you right above the shin, because they had those greaves covered the shin, but right above the shin in your knee, then you could actually fall forward. So this is just, again, a fun sort of scholarly thing that's been out there lately. And
what about you're looking down at the person and it hits you?
I still think it would probably most likely knock you backwards. And then the amount of armor that he had on actually would have weighed 126 pounds. So if a big dude got hit in the knee really hard, fell over, you would have all this armor on. It actually would have been very hard to stand back up, right? You can kind of imagine him sort of rolling around on the ground, being like, ow, ow, and so at that point, David is able to run up, takes his own, Goliath's own sword, and is able to kill him. So whether he fell backwards and forwards or backwards, it's really no consequence, except it's just kind of fun. And I thought it would be a fun time for you guys to actually see some Hebrew and kind of like talk about that, which I think is great. And again, because I'm a nerd, I just think stuff like this is really fun to look at it. So more likely, he got hit above the shin, fell forward, and with all his armor, couldn't get up, which is fun. Okay, so let's get back to looking at the early life of David. Really, I'm just going to kind of give you some cliff notes at this point. So after David kills Goliath, he is brought into Saul's court. David becomes very close with Saul's son Jonathan. They form what's called sort of a covenant between the two of them. Saul begins to send David out to lead his troops, and every campaign that he sends David on is successful. And Saul begins to fear David, because he begins to see how much authority he's gaining. Everybody likes David. David is super successful in war. So that begins to feel kind of a threat. And then there's this one time where David is coming back from a battle, and all these women sort of line the road, and they start singing, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. And at this point, Saul is scared, and he thinks, this guy is too much of a threat for me. So from then on, Saul begins looking actually for a way to try and kill David. Just because he's threatened by him. Saul's daughter Michal falls in love with David, and so what Saul says is, because David is not from a wealthy family, he says her bride price will be the foreskin, so like foreheads of 100 Philistines. So David's like, all right, I got that. And so he goes off, takes some of his men, kills 100 Philistines, brings them back. And he's like, oh, great, did I get your daughter now? So he does. He marries Michal. The text says, though, that an evil spirit continually comes upon Saul and Saul still continues to begin to try and kill David, and even really starts to do it outward. We get a couple of scenes where he throws a spear at David, which is great. Jonathan and David's wife Michal actually end up helping him escape because both of them do love him. And David goes and seeks refuge with a priest named I'm pausing. Ahimelech. Okay, Ahimelech, in the town of Nob. And Ahimelech actually at that point gives him Goliath's sword. So somehow Goliath's sword in the meantime had been left in the town of Nob. And Saul unfortunately later slaughtered the entire town of Nob for taking in David, for giving him refuge, which is really sad. It kills something like 85 priests, but then also says it kills women, children, everything. So Saul's kind of losing it at this point. And David flees. And it's really kind of a cool, short little passage. A group of misfits sort of form around him. So just really quick, I'm going to read 1 Samuel 22, 1 through 4. If you want to skip over, you're welcome to, or I'll just read it. And so it says that David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. From there, David went to Mizpah in Moab. So remember, Moab is not Israel. It's a neighbor. That's where Ruth was from. And said to the king of Moab, would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me? So he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in his stronghold. So at this point, Saul is continually trying to kill David. And so David flees. His family flees, too, because I'm sure they're afraid for their own lives. David puts his parents with the king of Moab just to take care of them, which is nice. The king of Moab does that. There's also this really sweet story we read of this woman named Abigail who brings supplies to David and his men, even though her husband Nabal is a mean man and says not to. And what's kind of fun, it's a very sweet story, but later when Abigail's husband dies, David will go back and get her and will marry her, and she'll become one of his wives. And she's described as wise and beautiful, and I think that's why we get a lot of Abigails in the world. And she seems like a lovely woman. So David will also take refuge in Philistine territory for a season, which is really interesting because he has also killed a lot of Philistines, but he does. But eventually during a battle with the Philistines, Saul and his sons are going to be killed, and including Jonathan. And at that point, Judah then anoints David as king, but just Judah initially. Abner, the commander of Saul's army, makes Ishbosheth, which is one of Saul's sons that is not killed, king over Israel. So for a brief period, Ishbosheth is king over Israel, actually for 7 years. But Ishbosheth greatly offends Abner, and so Abner actually kind of rallies to David and begins to actually try and convince the rest of the Israelites to come over to David to make David king. Joab, though, David's army commander, does not like Abner defecting, thinks that he is not for real, and ends up killing him. And then at this point, there's sort of strife, and Ishbosheth is killed by 2 of his own men, sort of internally. So after 7 years, then all of Israel then rallies to David, and is going to make David king over all of them. So for 7 years, he was just Judah, then the rest of the time, and he rules for 40 years. So it's 33 years over everyone, the first initial 7 just over Judah. David will conquer Jerusalem, which is a huge feat. The Jebusites had lived there and had never been able to be conquered up until this point. He also is going to establish that as the capital of Israel. He's going to bring the Ark of the Covenant there, so we begin to see sort of this centralized Israel forming. That now they do have the single king. They've got Jerusalem. They've brought the Ark of the Covenant. And then David says that he wants to actually build a temple for the house of God. But it's interesting. This is the last little bit of scripture I'll read for today. God says no. Says that's not going to be your job. I'm going to read from 2 Samuel, actually. We skipped over 2 Samuel, verse 7. or chapter 7, 2 Samuel 7. Okay. Last bits of scripture for today. So the Lord declares to you, the Lord himself will establish a house for you. So this is God speaking to him. So David says, I'm going to build a house for you, God. And God says, no. He says, I will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So forever is a really big word. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands, but my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And then I'm going to, picking up in verse 38, look at David's response. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? As if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human. Skipping down to verse 22. How great you are, sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard from our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth that God went out to redeem as a people for himself, and to make a name for himself, and to perform great and awesome wonders by driving out nations and their gods from before your people, whom you redeemed from Egypt. You've established your people Israel as your very own forever, and you, Lord, have become their God. So in verse 16, what does God say? He says, your house and your kingdom will endure before me forever. Your throne will be established forever. So one question that's been raised during our study is, where do the Jews get their sense of a Messiah? Where does that come from? So this verse contributes to their growing sense. You know, we get the sense that a great king is going to come from that tribe of Judah. Well, now we get the sense that this great king is going to rule forever. And like, how is that possible? And David's response, where he's like, who am I? Who is my family that you would do this for me? So this sense of this Messiah being a great king, remember how when Jesus comes, they don't expect him to be who he is. They expect a conquering physical king. They don't expect this person who's going to create a spiritual kingdom. So this is part of that sense that is developing. And even after the exile, which is fast forwarding, but we'll get to that, during that time period, the Israelite people begin to long for sort of a new David, someone who's going to reunite Israel, who's going to bring back sort of their heyday, their glory years. So that's really where they're beginning to get this sense of who and what their Messiah looks like. All right, so what have we learned from today? From David's anointing, we learned that God is not concerned about outward appearances. He is concerned about our hearts. God looks for hearts devoted to him, reliant on him, those concerned with what concerns God. With the battle of Goliath, we saw that, again, as we have seen through so many weeks, that God is the one who fights our battles. And we saw that David didn't rely on armor or personal strength, but he relied on God's power. And could God get that stone to hit that giant right in the exact right spot? And obviously he could. So a couple questions for you ladies for the last 10 minutes or so. To just talk about at your tables or with your neighbor if you want to. So David was selected by God because of his heart. And later in Scripture, we hear that he's called a man after God's own heart. So one question and these are all optional. You talk about anything you want. But one option is discuss what characteristics of his heart, of David's heart, you saw today in the study. David says he isn't afraid of Goliath because God has protected him from lions and bears in the past. Share a story of God where God defeated something huge in your life in the past. Or share something that seems like a giant right now in your life that you need God to fight for you. And then also, you're welcome to share any prayer requests you ladies have for this week. So I'll close us in about 10 minutes. Enjoy a few minutes talking to each other.